It is April 2018. An American military aircraft was coming in over Djibouti when the cockpit suddenly lit up. The source of this anomaly was a high-powered laser aimed straight at the aircrew during a critical moment. 2 US airmen suffered minor eye injuries. US officials said the laser was coming from China's new military facility, just a few miles from the main American base. China denied the accusation, and the world barely noticed. But that incident, a beam of light from a base that didn't exist a few years earlier, tells you what has changed. African countries are slowly becoming a hotspot for a new kind of competition between these two superpowers. The question is, who is profiting from this? In late 1963, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai boarded a plane and set off on one of the most ambitious diplomatic tours Africa had seen from a major world power. Over 7 weeks, he visited 10 newly independent countries, carrying a simple message. China and Africa shared a past. Both had been humiliated by foreign powers. Both were trying to build something new. China wasn't just offering words. A few years later, Zambia needed a way to reach the sea without depending on routes controlled by white minority regimes to the south. Tanzania needed infrastructure. Western governments and lenders dismissed the idea as too expensive and strategically risky. China, on the other hand, stepped forward. Beginning in 1970, Beijing helped finance and build the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, known as TAZARA. 1,860 kilometers of track cut through mountains, jungles, and remote terrain. Tens of thousands of Chinese and African workers were mobilized for that project. The cost ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, often estimated around $500 million in 1970s prices. TAZARA became more than a railway. It became a symbol. Two countries from the global south building what the West said wasn't worth building. The United States, meanwhile, was operating under a very different logic. In January 1961, Congo's first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, was executed with investigations revealing the CIA's fingerprints all over the shit show led by Belgium. What followed was a familiar pattern. The US spent millions on covert operations in the Congo, helping shape an outcome that elevated Mobutu Sese Seko, an anti-communist strongman who would rule for decades, looting the country while remaining a strategic ally. That logic repeated itself across the continent. In Angola, Washington secretly backed rebel movements fighting a Soviet-aligned government. In Somalia, the US supported a dictator through the Cold War, then intervened after the state collapsed, only to withdraw after the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu. After the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu left 18 American soldiers dead. The image shocked the US public. President Clinton ordered a pullout, and then came the moment that froze American policy in place. 6 months after US forces left Somalia, genocide erupted in Rwanda. In roughly 100 days, more than 800,000 people were killed. Inside the Clinton administration, officials hesitated to even use the word genocide. They were wary of the political and legal pressure that might force another African intervention. The lesson Washington absorbed was brutal and simple. Africa was dangerous, costly, and politically unforgiving. So by the end of the Cold War, the contrast was clear. China had built railways, ports, and political capital. The United States, on the other hand, had backed strongmen, suffered public trauma, and pulled back. Two different histories, two different playbooks. And by the end of the Cold War, one power largely deprioritized the continent, the other didn't. In the year 2000, while the United States was consumed by a contested presidential election, China launched something that barely registered in Washington. It was called the Forum on China-African Cooperation. On paper, it was just a diplomatic meeting, but in reality, it marked the beginning of the most sustained infrastructure push Africa had ever seen from a single external power. The escalation was rapid. In 2006, China pledged $5 billion to Africa. By 2012, that figure had risen to $20 billion. By 2015, it had reached $60 billion. Between 2000 and 2023, Chinese lenders committed roughly $182 billion across more than 1,300 loans to 49 African governments. There were railways in Kenya, hydropower dams in Uganda, ports in Djibouti, roads, airports, power plants, projects that reshaped how goods, energy, and people moved across the continent. What made China's approach different wasn't just the scale, it was the terms. You see, Western lenders like the World Bank, IMF tied financing to political reforms, anti-corruption measures, and lengthy negotiations. Many African governments viewed those conditions as slow, intrusive, and politically risky. China, on the other hand, offered an alternative. Beijing framed its engagement around non-interference and mutual respect. Loans were negotiated faster. They were not conditioned on governance reforms or electoral standards. While Chinese cranes were rising across African cities, the United States was pivoting in a very different direction. You see, after the 1998 US embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and especially after September 11, 2001, American policy toward Africa became increasingly dominated by counterterrorism. In 2008, the Pentagon launched United States Africa Command, a unified command for the continent, but no African country wanted to host it. Nigeria declined, South Africa declined, even Libya said no. So AFRICOM ended up headquartered in Stuttgart, Germany, thousands of miles from the continent it was created to oversee. Over the years that followed, the US built a network of dozens of military sites, access points, and partnerships across Africa. What it did not build, however, at scale were railways, ports, or power plants that served the people. The contrast became hard to ignore. China was financing visible infrastructural projects that citizens use every day. The United States, meanwhile, was investing primarily in security. Two superpowers, two radically different bets, and for nearly 2 decades, Washington underestimated how wide that gap had become. In December 2017, a document landed on the president's desk that marked a turning point. The Trump administration's national security strategy gave unprecedented attention to China, recasting it as a strategic competitor. It accused Beijing of corrupting elites, dominating extractive industries, and locking developing countries into opaque and unsustainable debt. A year later, National Security Advisor John Bolton made the message explicit. Speaking at the Heritage Foundation, he repeatedly warned that China's predatory practices in Africa posed a direct threat to US national security. Almost overnight, Africa stopped being an afterthought in Washington. It became a frontline project. But this is where the story gets quite uncomfortable, because the narrative the United States began pushing, that China was deliberately trapping African countries in debt and then seizing their assets, it wasn't quite true. The phrase debt trap diplomacy was coined in 2017 by an Indian scholar. It spread fast and it seemed to have proof. You see, Sri Lanka's Hambantota port leased to a Chinese company for 99 years. Except when researchers examined the case closely, the picture changed. Studies from Johns Hopkins University and Georgetown University found that Hambantota was proposed by Sri Lanka itself, rejected by Western partners, and later financed by China. The lease was not triggered by a default on Chinese loans, but by Sri Lanka's broader foreign currency crisis. And across Africa, the pattern held. Despite hundreds of billions in lending, no documented case exists of a Chinese lender seizing a sovereign African asset through debt enforcement. Beijing has cancelled billions of dollars in African debt and restructured tens of billions more. But dismissing the problem entirely would be a mistake too. You see, those same researchers uncovered something else. Roughly 3/4 of Chinese loan contracts bar coordination with other creditors. Many include strict confidentiality clauses. Some contain cross-default provisions allowing China to terminate agreements if a borrower takes actions deemed harmful to any Chinese entity. So the debt trap narrative was too simple. The reality is more subtle and potentially more dangerous, but that's not the story for today. It was not a crude scheme of asset seizures, but a dense web of opaque agreements that give Beijing quite leverage over financially vulnerable governments. That is the reckoning America arrived at. And by the time Washington fully understood it, China was already embedded in the continent. On July 26, 2023, soldiers in Niger seized power and America's counter-terrorism strategy in the Sahel began to collapse. Niger wasn't just another coup. It hosted Airbase 201, a $110 million drone hub near Agadez that anchored American surveillance across West Africa. Nearly 1,000 US personnel were tied to the mission. Niger was the keystone. Then, the keystone cracked. In early 2024, the leaders in Niger revoked its military agreement with Washington. The US agreed to leave, and by July, American forces had withdrawn from the capital. And even before the exit was complete, the replacement had arrived. In April 2024, Niger announced the arrival of Russian military instructors and equipment. A month later, Russian personnel were photographed entering a base still hosting US troops, an unmistakable image of some sort of handover happening in real time. This wasn't isolated. The same pattern had already played out in Mali and Burkina Faso. 3 coups, 3 Western withdrawals, and Russia stepping in each time to fill that vacuum. Now, here's the part of this story everyone keeps getting wrong. Africa isn't merely a chessboard in this story. It is a player. Take Djibouti for example. When the US lease for Camp Lemonnier came up for renewal in 2014, President Ismail Omar Guelleh had leverage. Other powers were cycling. Washington's rent doubled from $31.5 million to about $63 million a year. 3 years later, China opened its own base nearby, paying even more. Today, Djibouti earns hundreds of millions of dollars annually from hosting foreign military bases, money that makes up a significant share of its economy. Geography became revenue for them. Or look at Kenya. Nairobi renegotiated terms around its Chinese-financed railway, easing short-term repayment pressure. Then it deepened military ties with Washington, securing major non-NATO ally status. This was Chinese infrastructure, but American security. That's what you call maximum leverage. Even resource-rich states are learning the same lesson here. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces roughly 70% of the world's cobalt, a mineral essential to electric vehicles and batteries. When Kinshasa began signaling tighter controls and a push for more value at home, markets reacted. And both Beijing and Washington paid close attention. This is becoming more like a strategy in Africa. Africa's land and resources are once more the prize, and we are getting into some kind of bidding war scenarios here. Coming back to where the story began, in Djibouti, 2 pilots, a beam of light. Now you can see what that moment was really about. It wasn't an accident, not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a collision decades in the making, set in motion by Cold War choices, by China's early courtship of post-colonial Africa, by America's turn towards security over development, and by every railway, base, and alliance that eventually placed 2 superpowers on the same stretch of land. Today, the scale of that competition is unmistakable. The vast majority of African countries have signed cooperation agreements with China under the Belt and Road Framework. The United States maintains dozens of military sites and access points across the continent. Russia has moved in aggressively also into several security vacuums, and middle powers from the UAE to Turkey to Saudi Arabia are placing their own strategic bets. At the center of it all are 1.4 billion people, the world's fastest growing consumer market and critical resources. The question is, will this new scramble benefit Africans, or just more of the same old song?